Awesome. Thank you. So today I'll be discussing the Internet of Things and intimate partner abuse, examining prevalence, risks, and outcomes. I'll begin with a discussion of some of the background and motivation for this project. Then I'll discuss findings from a study my colleague and mentor, Dr. Ruth Schiller, and I conducted. And from there, I'll highlight some preliminary work from my ongoing dissertation project, which centers on this topic as well. And I'll conclude with a discussion of some emergent directions for future research that our findings begin to point towards. Yeah, when we tested it, it was pretty. Yeah. I'm not sure what the change is. Yep, I think we're all set now. All right. So across the globe and in the state of Michigan, my own backyard, the ongoing social impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic also extend to experiences of domestic abuse and intimate partner violence. Data reported from the Michigan Coalition to End Domestic and Sexual Violence and other organizations demonstrate that over the course of the pandemic, support agencies and law enforcement in various regions of the state have received double or more calls and other forms of support seeking from intimate abuse survivors during 2020 and 2021. And similar figures have been reported in many places throughout the US and worldwide. And these increases during the ongoing disruptions of the pandemic have pointed towards not just an increase in the prevalence of abuse, but also potentially the form and impacts of abuse. In a study from the University of Michigan examining the experiences of women and non-binary folks during mid-2022, their research found that not only that on the ground experiences of violence and abuse appeared to not only be increasing kind of in overall rates, but also in terms of the severity and need for support seeking that individual survivors reported. And from this ongoing conversation about addressing intimate partner abuse during the pandemic, has also emerged narratives about the role of computing technology in abuse, both as a tool to support survivors remotely during stay-at-home orders and as a potential point of vulnerability in accessing private information and engaging in coercive, harassing, threatening, and other kinds of abusive behavior. This point, in light of sustained societal shifts in the ongoing wake of COVID-19, including high rates of working from home and the related spikes in intimate violence, this raises an imperative to critically examine the role of home computing ecosystems in interpersonal and intimate violence. As the work those of you who have been involved with the Gender and IoT project have repeatedly identified, novel technological ecosystems, including IoT, pose challenges for both effective cybersecurity policy interventions and tools for support providers on the ground. Drawing on my expertise in human-computer interaction, particularly my experience in critically examining how social values germinate through the implementation of novel computing devices, I argue that domestic violence in the modern world is in large part a computing design issue. And as HCI scholars continue to reiterate, technology gains power and meaning in the world from the social outcomes that it facilitates. Thus, purely technical approaches and usability tests that occur outside the real, messy context of everyday families, homes, and lives cannot fully prevent or ameliorate tech-mediated harms. Based on emerging HCI scholarship, I argue that our discipline requires a flexible, tactile set of guidelines, benchmarks, and threat assessment tools for considering intimate harms before the first line of code is written or prototype sketched. And accomplishing this necessitates collaborating with experts who are already doing this work, which makes me especially thrilled to begin this critical bridging work with you all today, with your expertise in IoT threat modeling, policy intervention, cybersecurity approaches, among many other topics. It is my aim with the project that I'm discussing today, in which I examine the role of smart home ecosystems in the hands of abusers and outcomes for survivors, to contribute to human-computer interaction, computer-supported cooperative work, and related scholarship in the social sciences. HCI is well situated to contribute to meaningful impacts in this area, particularly in light of participatory design approaches that are particularly effective in engaging users in the features and implementations of new technologies. And these approaches, derived from the lived experiences of survivors, serve as a powerful entry point to marry tech and violence issues that affect people's everyday lives. But beginning to develop an HCI toolkit for harms requires a design-minded lens turns towards the lived everyday experiences of survivors. The who, what, when, where, and how of IoT ecosystems becoming active agents in experiences of abuse, which leads me to the research I'll be discussing today. I want to begin my discussion by framing what I'll be talking about today in the shadow cast by my research findings from this project. So I'm going to briefly highlight what we found in the multiple choice and free response survey that I'll be basing the discussion of my findings on today. So keep these in mind through the course of the talk, and then I'm going to revisit them again at the end before I open the floor for discussion. So first, we found that just the presence of Internet of Things devices in the home predicts experiencing intimate violence. And we argue that this serves to suggest that the amplification of existing condition and tendency towards experiences of abuse, violence, and harassment in the home. And that this includes implications for support seeking and personal impacts and understanding the role of IoT in these experiences of violence. Additionally, we also, from our survey, particularly the free response and qualitative analysis component, we found an emerging pattern of abusers justifying their misuse of Internet of Things devices is what we coin coercive care, where abusers justify unwanted activities such as surveillance or GPS monitoring through a lens of kindness, care, and love. Additionally, we found that support practices that emerged from the experiences of survivors suggest that the folks and resources that are being contacted for help and advice in interpreting and understanding and responding to these harms look more like friend groups and casual social engagements rather than necessarily reaching out to traditionally imagined resources of support, such as a tech support resource or the company itself. And while some of this may be that access to these kinds of useful resources is still a really emerging area, this critical role of social support and understanding and responding to these experiences of violence has a strong precedent in the existing scholarship and online communities and online support seeking for health conditions and experiences of survivors of sexual abuse. So this is an interesting finding in thinking about the implications of that and what structuring a more meaningful community-centered support for survivors of tech-mediated intimate abuse could look like. And finally, we conclude with the argument that IoT are not neutral or passive, but play an active role in collecting and distributing data and material that is rife for abuse. They become agents of harm and co-conspirators in trajectories of abuse and play a role in extending the reach and possibilities of abusive and coercive behaviors and tendencies. Even beyond intimate abuse and domestic violence, the internet and online communication technology generally has been marked by consistently high levels of identity-based violence and harassment, as this data from a Pew survey of US adults outline prevalence rates for what they define as severe behaviors such as physical threats and sexual harassment, and what they describe as less severe behaviors such as name calling or intentional embarrassment. And as this example demonstrates, that high rates of violence and harassment, particularly what's defined as the more severe experiences of harassment, are particularly common for people presenting with traits culturally recognized as feminine, LGBTQ+ folks, people of color, and other historically marginalized groups. And in understanding ways to prevent and, there we go. And understanding ways to prevent and respond to internet-mediated violence and harassment, much attention has been given to technical security breaches related to financial outcomes and other kinds of criminal activity with more robust legal architectures to address. And to this end, traditional definitions of cybercrime also often center on the stereotype of the anonymous hacker in a dark room. And without discounting the market prevalence, impact, and implications of anonymous text-based online violence and harassment, there is growing evidence that this approach to understanding internet-mediated violence is incomplete, especially as a wider variety of computing devices become integrated into more and more everyday routines. Additionally, legal and policy interventions also face particular hurdles in attempting to be applied to interpersonal conditions of abuse outside certain more well-defined contexts. This perspective may overlook some of the most personally impactful and emerging as highly prevalent experiences of computer-mediated harms and violence, referring to computer-mediated intimate partner abuse. There's a relative dearth of scholarship on how computer-mediated interaction and resulting data flows can impact existing close relationships with known actors, like in friendships, familial relationships, and romantic partners. Further, there's strong evidence that many behaviors commonly associated with cyber violence, such as stalking, identity-based harassment, non-consensual data access and sharing, such as revenge porn, and so on, are more common and have more severe adverse personal impacts when they take place within the context of established intimate relationships. To this end, I'm going to briefly highlight just a few examples about the prevalence and impacts of computer-mediated intimate partner violence, including how these experiences are interpreted through a cultural lens of defining what is violence that is important and most common. First, intimate partner cyberstalking, referred to repeated use of electronic communication technologies to harass or frighten someone in the context of a current or former intimate relationship. Evidence suggests that intimate cyberstalking is more common than being stalked by a stranger or other unknown actor. The prevalence rates compiled and highlighted here vary quite broadly with this meta-analysis I'm drawing from, ranging from about occurring in about 10 to 50% of relationships based on differences in sample characteristics and the definition of cyberstalking used. Of course, tech-mediated stalking manifests in adverse outcomes for survivors, with over half of all physically violent encounters in the context of current or former intimate relationships being preceded by some kind of stalking activity. An important point in considering this as well is societal perceptions of this kind of tech-mediated violence. In one survey, scholars found that the general public viewed stranger stalking as being more likely to be threatening and more harmful to individuals, despite this evidence to the contrary, which suggests the significance in considering of how this orientation may contribute to dismissal and avoidance in support systems, and may make it even more challenging for individuals to recognize abusive and harmful behavior. Another example is revenge porn, referring to the sharing of audio, video, or other information related to sexual content that is non-consensual sharing. As this slide also demonstrates, experiences of revenge porn are quite common in intimate relationships. And further, experiences of revenge porn is often associated with other data breaches, which examples here showing prevalence rates have also abusers sharing full name, home address, and other personal information related to the survivor, again, further impacting the scope and prevalence of abuse. Even in these rapidly emerging examinations of violence in the context of digital intimacies, there has been limited inquiry into how these potential vulnerabilities and harms manifest in the context of ubiquitous computing, including smart homes and the Internet of Things, which consist of devices designed to be invisibly embedded into everyday routines, collecting data and optimizing their function to fit user and household habits. As Internet of Things devices ranging from personal assistants like Alexa and Google Home to smart refrigerators and home energy systems continue to penetrate the consumer market at exponential rates, they further merit critical attention to the way they may be contributing to positive and negative interpersonal outcomes. Now, I don't want to be completely doom and gloom about these technologies. Intimate HCI scholarship, which is focused on the role of computing in romantic relationships, have widely evidenced really positive support outcomes, including more easily being able to carve out time to spend with one another in a couple situation, increased feelings of trust and intimacy, feelings of connection across physical distance, and so on, not to mention the valuable impacts of IoT ecosystems for caretaking and other valuable roles in everyday life. But while there is growing attention to the potential harms of these new kinds of computing, particularly privacy and security concerns surrounding big data and institutional surveillance, we're still scratching the surface of prevalence, risk factors, and outcomes situated in the complexities of domestic lived experiences with ubiquitous computing systems, particularly how survivors access support resources for Internet of Things being used by abusers in the home. Before moving into my driving research questions, I want to highlight 5 design factors related to how IoT function and the socio-technical results of how they're often used in home situations, which I argue situate them as a critical point of inquiry in the role of ubiquitous computing technologies in intimate partner violence. First, there are tens of thousands of different kinds of IoT devices coming from different developers using different software and platforms and protocols, which raises major questions when companies dissolve or are acquired, when updates stop, and not to mention how it just takes one device to become an entry point for a whole home or larger network. Additionally, the vulnerabilities of intimate relationships that we take for granted, such as being familiar with one another's daily routines or information that is commonly prompted for security questions and passwords, can create massive vulnerabilities in IoT infrastructures when interpersonal relationships break down and shift. Additionally, mental models of privacy scholarship find that people care about their personal privacy, but can find it challenging to articulate personal standards for private data related to their behavior with ubiquitous devices. In addition to, as I highlighted earlier, these high increases in intimate partner violence during societal shifts with COVID have a chance to interact with the capacities of IoT in ways rife for abuse. Additionally, there's extensive evidence that the role of support seeking and using particularly online points of connection, such as online communities for sharing stories and overcoming the challenges of violent situations, can serve as an important reservoir of support for survivors, which is particularly in conditions of isolation, when those pathways to making those kinds of internet-mediated connections become compromised, can further lead to isolation and adverse impacts. And finally, there's emerging research in human-computer interaction, criticizing and thinking of ways beyond existing bodies of consent, entering into terms and conditions and contracts with the use of new devices and software, and thinking about ways to consider how dynamic and living contracts may better respond to the changes in relationships and complexity of these dynamics as relationships shift, and so subsequent use of devices that was once acceptable or normal becomes a pattern in abusive behaviors. So in summary, the significance of this inquiry is centered in the way that IoT continues to penetrate consumer homes at rapid rates, with these devices having a variety of distinct design capacities that suggest a likelihood of being related to experiences of abuse. So moving into my research questions. This situates for research question 1. Which is centered primarily around the prevalence and risk factors related to experiences of abuse. Research question 2, how do experiences of violence related to IoT devices intersect with domestic work and gendered experiences of computing technology? As I argue, technology gains meaning from social context, and particularly in the realm of internet connected devices and security devices, the burden of safety work, referring to activities related to managing personal safety, well-being of family and the home, often falls on women in these contexts. And finally, research question 3, I'm also interrogating with this inquiry, how does IoT intersect with the concept of informed consent defined interpersonally and technologically? In examining the lived experiences of survivors of IoT-mediated violence, I am undertaking a critical investigation of design approaches that may or may not be acceptable or failing in the context of these relationships. So for this exploratory study examining the role of demographics, internet use behavior, generally experiences of non-tech abuse and tech-mediated abuse, and support-seeking outcomes, we conducted an online survey in order to leave space for respondents to report novel experiences related to Internet of Things and devices. We loosely organized the questions and what the survey captured around 6 broad categories of IoT centered on their primary function and features, which were personal assistance, GPS-enabled systems, home security systems, smart energy systems, familial monitoring technologies, primarily referring to baby or children related monitoring audiovisual systems, and finally personal health functions. The survey consisted of multiple choice and free response items. Our sample was an MTurk sample from the Amazon Mechanical Turk platform of self-identified women 18 and up currently residing in the US who self-identified as both internet users and having experienced intimate partner violence currently or at any point in their lives. Our final N was 384 respondents. So moving into our findings, I want to first highlight, so these are the descriptive findings from our survey, with the left-hand column being the category of devices being centered on in that question. The second column refers to the percentage of respondents who reported owning one or more devices within this category. So owning one or more personal assistant, smart energy devices, each provided with a short definition. And the third column is from the category of respondents who self-reported owning or having at one point owned one or more of those devices, the percentage who reported an experience of violence, abuse, and harassment from a current or former intimate partner one or more times. So I want to frame the findings that just in the context of these descriptives, that these rates of self-reported violence and abuse in general are quite high. Consider that even a figure like 5% of all IoT ever being put into the hands of consumers being involved in abuse, that would still be 500 million devices. Even 1% of all devices being implemented involved in an abusive situation would be over 100 million devices. So I really want to highlight here that as the sample begins to demonstrate that even a deceptively small percentage can point to huge impacts as these technologies continue to penetrate consumer markets in exponential ways. For the first part of our analysis, my colleague Dr. Schiller and I tested a structural equation model using smart PLS techniques. I will link at the end of this PowerPoint and share out with everyone a conference paper in which we publish further details on our theoretical motivations and process for using this approach. As this model demonstrates, experiencing Internet of Things mediated violence appears to intersect with existing trajectories of traditional, referring to in-person interactions, such as name calling, physical encounters, and so on, including emotional and verbal abuse that occur outside of the context of identified tech-mediated intimate partner abuse. For this exploratory analysis, we first examined if IoT use, defined as any past or present IoT use in the home, had any relationship with experiencing abuse in general. And of course, we unsurprisingly found that IoT use in general predicted experiencing IoT abuse. But this finding becomes interesting in contrast to the relationship between IoT use and traditional abuse. This comparison suggests that the mere presence of IoT in the home has a positive relationship with experiencing violence, even kinds of violence that are not necessarily mediated by technology. And further, we found that both IoT abuse and traditional abuse had a positive relationship with experienced adverse impacts of abuse. Impacts of abuse here refers to adverse consequences of intimate partner violence, including reported adverse impacts on physical health, ability to work a job, economic stability, relationships with friends and family, and so on. The positive predictive relationship between IoT abuse and impacts of abuse has a correlation nearly 3 times as strong as that for traditional abuse. Due to the exploratory nature of this study, more data are needed to begin making stronger causal and theoretical claims. But this model begins to point to potential relationships to dig into further in future scholarship. And to begin doing this theory building work comes the second part of my analysis, in which my colleagues and I conducted a qualitative content analysis of the free response items from the survey. And in addition to this statistical analysis, we conducted this bottom-up qualitative coding of free response items, which probe personal narratives of experiences of violence and support seeking. And I'll be presenting these findings in an in-progress manuscript. So these quotes that I'll be sharing are prototypical examples from our qualitative coding and analysis related to several emerging findings regarding experiences of violence and support seeking. So the first quote shared here, they used my Siri to read my private text out loud, is an example of a pattern that emerged in the data. We're making data that survivors interpreted as private, such as texts or notes on their phone, explicit, which I use explicit here to refer to putting it into another medium or making it visible to people that were unintended, or otherwise changing the way that that information is represented into what audience is viewed as an abusive experience and is related to IoT capacities, for example, such as recalling search histories, or with shared iCloud accounts, being able to access text message history, such as this example, and so on. Additionally, the audio-visual capacities of Internet of Things devices were also repeatedly related to experiences that participants reported as experiences of violence. For example, this respondent reported, they used our apartment security cameras indoors to track my behavior, how much I ate, how often I was on my phone / computer. And this is an example of how innocuous everyday activities, when they're enmeshed in the reach of Internet of Things devices to capture and monitor those activities in ways that are harassing or coercive and controlling, become a vehicle of amplifying the reach and capacity of these kinds of harms. Our second emerging finding from the qualitative data is what we describe as IoT supports coercive care, which is a repeated pattern of abusers describing activities that they used IoT devices for. When survivors, would push back about them being unwanted or unhelpful, the abusers would justify unwanted surveillance via IoT as coming from a place of love, care, and security. For example, in this quote, "My ex-husband was monitoring me through video cameras in our home. I did not notice them because they were hidden, but I found the images on the desktop, and that is how I got completely disgusted about him. He said it was for my safety, but no, it wasn't. He was way too jealous and just wanted to spy on my movements." So this is an example of where, and this is an idea I'm going to come back to in some of the later findings as well, where the survivor was unaware the device was in use at all and discovered it through spontaneous chance, through happenstance. And then with the abuser kind of justifying this activity, saying it was for their safety, indicative of this pattern of abusers when either being discovered or explicitly using a device, framing it within this lens of, I'm only using this or doing this because I love and care about you, rather than sort of recognizing it as the unwanted violence. Additionally, here's an example from another survivor. "I will not take these matters as seriously because my partner is doing all these things for my family's welfare. I could not tell this to anyone." And this is an example, kind of a dichotomy between this recognition from the survivor as, interpreting this activity through the lens of kind of the partner acting in a way to care for the family's well-being, while still by writing this in a free response item about abusive activities, is recognizing this as in ways harmful, and also through the comment, "I could not tell this to anyone," again, kind of suggesting the feeling of sort of isolation and overarching control that these devices contributed to. Additionally, finding 3, informal support networks challenge preconceptions about seeking support for computing harms. In interpreting and responding to these experiences of IoT-mediated abuse, we found that respondents repeatedly sought out informal support structures, specifically groups of female friends. And in these groups, individuals engaged in collaborative knowledge sharing and participated in really creative technical and social solutions to IoT-mediated abuse problems. And that in these examples, there was limited evidence indicative of more formal kind of support seeking, such as seeking out the developer of a company, like on a tech support page, or interacting with law enforcement or other institutional resources. As this example demonstrates, one survivor shared, "I talked with my response to the free response item, if you thought about or engaged in activities to seek support for these experiences, what did that look like?" Here they shared, "I talked with my friends a lot. They taught me specific ways to lock Siri and turn it off so he couldn't use it to read my texts." So this is kind of an explicit example of sort of friends through the trust and connection of that social connection in these friend groups, learning explicit sort of security behaviors to help ameliorate some of these experiences of violence. Additionally, there was also another emerging thread of going even beyond kind of sharing knowledge and engaging in sort of a technical or sort of playing with UI settings or something with that kind of solution, moving into ways friends served as a kind of social lubricant around security behaviors that could be interpreted as escalatory. In this example, the survivor shared, "My friends were the ones that suggested that I try blocking him, only to have him find out through our mutual friends via location sharing. After venting several times and taking pictures and selfies with only the female friends present, I would send those back so that he knew who I was with and that I wasn't cheating. Friends were the ones that helped me cope with it and backed me up when I disabled location sharing, saying that they didn't use it either for the same reasons." So this is a really compelling example of a thread of friends not only sharing strategies for engaging in security practices and experiences of IoT-mediated abuse, but also sort of using their capacity as social actors and trusted friends to potentially buffer activities that would be viewed as potentially escalatory and increasing harms, as in this example, when this individual chose to turn off location sharing, which could be viewed, interpreted as escalatory in the context of abuse. They would do things like take pictures with their friends or share that the friends had the same opinion and were doing the same activity to kind of justify this protective behavior. So in discussing and interpreting these findings, here again, I want to highlight takeaways I highlighted at the beginning of the talk. And we argue based on these findings that the Internet of Things sees, hears, speaks, and decides based on sharing protocol that can skew in favors of abusers and existing orientations and behavioral precedent of seeking power and control over other people sharing space with IoT devices, and that these design choices intersect with existing trajectories of gendered violence in computing design spaces. Additionally, these early findings point towards several potential takeaways to probe in future participant-driven design research. Here, I'm highlighting the model of consent used by Planned Parenthood and other sex ed and sexual kind of consent agencies. The Fry's model, freely given, reversible, informed, enthusiastic, specific. And in human-computer interaction and related spaces, there's some emerging discussion about ways this model of consent versus the kind of sort of static, time-constrained model of entering into contracts for software and device use could be adapted in this form to be more dynamic to the contextual influences and shifts that occur in relationships, particularly in how abusive relationships generally don't start that way and will escalate and change, and thus necessitate potential shifts in models of consent. So these findings begin to build on those directions as well. Additionally, these findings suggest that there's value in examining more closely and better understanding how support seeking manifests in these findings related to the use of informal social support groups for sharing experiences and learning new strategies related to experiences of violence. In this reflects existing IPV scholarship, particularly in the context of online communities and online support seeking, but also raises new questions and challenges for what actual support seeking looks like. So in conclusion, I argue that IoT merit a recalibration of social, technical, and legal approaches, and that these harms, based on a history of empirical evidence related to the way design manifests in violence, that these kinds of harms are tragically not novel or surprising in these social technical infrastructures and should be anticipated across stages of design. And I hope to contribute this work and the research next steps that result from it towards building design toolkits that can incorporate expertise across more sectors, including policy, law enforcement, and public health models related to assessing harm before, during, and after design are implemented. And additionally, these data suggest the power of making intimate data visible in surprising or unknown ways as a very common and difficult to overcome in existing models of consent and UI and IoT use to overcome. So that's a point that I think is worth in future scholarship kind of probing closely in experiences for participatory design. So in conclusion, these data suggest the value of synergizing policy approaches and technical standards. I also argue that these findings begin to point towards the value of in responsibility for tech-mediated harms, considering what a community and collective orientation with responsibility, especially drawing on if a kind of toolkit were implemented in this manner, what a community and collective orientation of responsibility could look like, drawing on expertise from various actors to create more cohesive and meaningful solutions for support seeking and preventing harms. There's also, I think, considerable more research to be done in better identifying both social and technical risk factors and the progression of these use experiences of technology in the context of abuse. In my own work, moving forward with this, I'm expanding on the survey study with my in progress right now a dissertation work, which consists of an online ethnography of intimate IoT-mediated abuse support communities, in addition to interviews with self-described IoT-mediated abuse survivors. I also recently received a grant to examine the role of IoT-mediated violence and abuse centered on the context of people living in mid-Michigan and considering Internet of Things mediated harms as a public health issue and better understanding the consequences of these kinds of devices for health and well-being for Michiganders. Additionally, I would love to continue to contribute work and scholarship towards the possibility of educational and training programs for everyday people and professionals related to IoT-mediated harms and violence, again, towards developing useful toolkits for harms, and additionally supporting the development of healthy norms around technology and intimacy. Thank you so much, everyone, for your time and attention. I would like to open the floor for any thoughts, questions, or ideas anyone would like to share. Thank you.
Thank you so much. You're lucky when you get the real applause. Are there questions online?
There are not currently, but I will put a little message.
So thank you so much. Just to say, I hope everybody will hear me online. Yeah, you posted it on the QA question. Maybe you posting it?
Yeah.
Yeah, cool. I mean, it's super interesting. It's very much aligning with like a lot of the work that is being done here, also for the PhD students. I was wondering, like, one thing I just can't really wrap my head around is with MTurk. You know, that there would be so many people, like even like self-identifying, like. Can I ask, like, how, like, your experience was with using this tool for such a specific research, and, you know, like, I'm really surprised that you would find that type of participant group on that platform.
Yeah, so something, and I'm actually going to talk a little more about these characteristics of the sample that we pulled in my talk for the InfoSec seminar tomorrow. But we found in this population, in addition to some demographic issues that I want to diversify in future work, namely it was mostly white, slightly more wealthy population. But I also found that users in this population, understandably being MTurkers and being able to engage with like that fairly complex system, they had quite high levels of digital literacy and online security behaviors, things with frequency of changing passwords, using antivirus software, some of these kind of boilerplate like standard security behaviors. We found quite high levels of that behavior. So I do think that in part these prevalence rates are related to just a higher literacy around internet connected technology, that they may have the vocabulary and experience to better identify when Internet of Things devices are being used or what they're capable of being used for, or have a stronger kind of personal model of what they're comfortable with for privacy and security. I think the other factor that in part explains these prevalence rates is that we, in recruitment, we kept the definition of personal abuse quite broad, because part of the goal with this kind of exploratory study was being able to capture novel and emerging cases that may not be fully captured by existing like vocabulary existing in IoT and mediated harm spaces. So we did, in kind of cleaning the data and looking through, especially in the free response findings, shedding some light on this. Individuals, there were a few examples of individuals describing IoT-mediated abuse as something that's like phone scams and those kind of experiences of harm, which again are a form of tech-mediated abuse, but were a little different than the specific kind of domestic home-centered IoT context. So I think part of that, the sample was sort of in broadening our net. We also captured some of those like less, I hate to say it, like less sort of relevant use cases.
Any question online or in the room?
No, of course.
I've got a question about the sample. Are you able to share the ages, though? Because you said 18 plus. I just wondered the range of ages that were.
Yeah, we had quite a high range, and sort of in line with both internet use statistics generally and the kinds of people who experience online harassment. It skewed relatively young, like 35 and under was a large chunk of the sample. I think for the ultimate range, it probably tapped out. I have the specific demographics in another chart. I think it tapped out around 60 or 70 on the high end.
Generally under 35.
Yeah, generally young, more young.
So I wondered, you talked about product design, the importance of product design putting in at the beginning.
Yeah.
Are there at the moment any instances where design of products has helped? You know, are there products which are better than other products at the moment, or is this something that is on the table?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I think there's some really exciting approaches to thinking about like how IoT design could look different in some of these spaces. For example, there was the name of the authors is eluding me, but it was an approach to understanding kind of the manifestations of Internet of Things design using what they called a security food label. So it was the idea of a food or nutrition label, but it was for like, this is the IoT device, this is what it does, like really explicitly trying to outline what data it would collect and where it would go. And they found a lot of success in that, and people feeling like more equipped to not only define their own comfort level, what they were comfortable with the device sharing and using, but making like a better informed decision about what to use and how to integrate it. And I think the research too that I also highlighted, which is a little more about tech design generally, like thinking through models of consent that are able to be dynamic or change as interpersonal relationships shift. So I think kind of those two core properties have been receiving a lot of attention, but that how that's manifesting in design is still sort of ongoing. I think a strong recent example was with the issues with the AirTags controversy, with Apple implementing, for example, that an unknown AirTag that comes up on your network will like beep. So if a device, there is total unknown about a device, that's a way to kind of recognize it being there, which I think is really compelling in context of these findings too, of so many individuals, the harm coming from them not even knowing a device was in use. It's really hard to meaningfully consent or accept like data from a device you don't know exists or is even being used. So it seems like directions of like making devices more visible to kind of inform respondents in ways that like give them agency over how they respond to that is a meaningful direction too.
Yeah, there's a couple of questions online. One of them is very related to
Yeah.
about essentially, but slightly from the other angle. Are there, besides cameras and voice assistants, other types of connected devices that are less or even more potentially harmful in terms of use?
Yeah, that's a really good question. in some of the other, and a lot of this was derived kind of from the free response items, there were some less common, but also related experiences of abuse that respondents reported. One example was for like Fitbits or personal fitness trackers. There was an example of someone whose partner would be like domineering about what they ate or how many minutes they exercised, and that kind of violence. There was a similar scenario related to the amount that someone was like spending on food, which the person was monitoring through use of the smart refrigerator. And there was one example as well with the Nest thermostat system, where the abuser, they were the ones who sort of had the overarching control of the system. The survivor didn't have an account, and they made it so that the house, while the abuser themselves was like away, was like really, really unbearably hot until the individual was coerced into like doing something the abuser wanted, which is like, feels like a like wild and sort of disturbing example, but was something that came up, that these devices, just with their like flexibility and connection to like daily routines we don't even think about, like the temperature of our house that's comfortable, can be capitalized upon in these networks of control. So I think, and really what I'm hoping to contribute to with this research as these devices to continue to expand, you know, whether that looks like VR kind of IoT systems and things that are sort of on the cutting edge, what could like a useful toolkit or set of principles that's adaptable for new and emerging like capacities and contexts look like? So in an effort to kind of, you know, avoid like tripping over your own feet with being super like considering context, but not being super locked into necessarily one capacity. But I do think that there are, like, for example, the audio visual capacities, there's definitely, it seems like systems that like afford an abuser a lot of information and are easy technically to access, that there's a link there too.
Yeah. There's one more question online. Thank you for the talk. It's interesting. The relationship you found between the presence of IoT in the home predicting traditional abuse is intriguing and alarming. Do you have plans to investigate this finding further?
Yeah, I do. That was something that really struck me about these findings too, which to me, just in my initial interpretation, which is of course very guarded from what this data can allow, is that it might suggest that there's certain like capacities of an abusive individual who are drawn or more interested in buying and owning an IoT device, especially with evidence, for example, thinking about sort of who in family dynamics are the ones kind of like setting up the internet router, setting up new devices in the home generally, which often falls into a male role. So in thinking about that in the context of trajectories of abuse, I really want to, in my dissertation survey protocol, better understand what this like escalatory or predictive capacity might actually look like. And I also want to consider too, if it might be a situation of the relationship going in the opposite direction, if IoT might in some way be, you know, sort of, I don't want to say activating or creating a tendency that's not there, but it might sort of give an outlet for, you know, a desire for control or, you know, desire for something that maybe wouldn't have manifested as strongly without the feature of the device. I definitely think and I am hoping my data illuminates this, that I imagine that there's a capacity for it to be like a reciprocal relationship where the device, you know, is not like completely mandating outcomes, but might be supporting them. And then in turn, the activities and the motivations of the abuser, how that's expanding the reach of the technology and so on.
Okay, any
I'm just curious how, just in thinking about the execution, like how do you intend to sort of get these like research and ultimately kind of those kind of design principles that you come up with into the hands of technologists and product designers to kind of make sure that these are actually kind of get executed in real life and making that impact that you're seeing and wish to see?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I'm hoping kind of in sort of to talk about the near future future and where I see my research program going a little more like long term is in these next steps with my dissertation. I'm hoping to better be able to articulate risk factors, kind of a process of what firsthand experiences of escalation to these devices look like, better understanding of what the models of not only security behaviors and support seeking look like, but what driving risk factors related to design and these kind of interactions might manifest. But I think long term, what I want to be able to contribute to in like stoking and building these connections with designers and product testers is I want to continue building and bringing this research to HCI spaces where there are a lot of designers and a lot of product work going on, like the Human Factors in Computing Annual Conference, Computer Supportive Cooperative Work Annual Conference, where I have presented work on different topics before. I want to continue to work in those spaces where there's a lot of, in addition to kind of the traditional model of scholarship, there's a lot of really applied work and people like literally bringing things they have built or are building, stoking connections there. I also think, and this is sort of an ideal, but in building and outlining these, what I mentioned for this toolkit of design against harm that also factors in a model of community or collective responsibility. I think that I want to take away like the idea of fear that like it's a single designer or single person or single individual's like fault that when technology manifests. A lot of these technologies come from places of like really good intentions, but I want to shift it to more of like an idea of all of these different stakeholders with this complementary expertise, building it into a community orientation of what that connection and information flow could look like, whether it's some kind of database, whether it's some kind of collective that meets every so often, or any of these other potential ideas the data might drive. Is I'm really hoping that by shifting that orientation of responsibility to something like collective and collective center, that could shift to like more buy-in from, for example, tech companies, who obviously have a profit and other motive, like building that in ways that could also like support that while also supporting like better design outcomes too.
Brilliant. Well, it's 1 o'clock. So I don't know if there's still some people online. No.
There are some very appreciative comments.
So with that, I think the online space is already officially closed, but I thought it would be nice to give you a final round of applause and thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. And we have the chance to, if you want to, still speak with Megan, and we also have more people here who are interested. Claudia, you're here as well.
Yeah, I have a curiosity reality.
Yeah.
Since I'm working on.
Thank you so much for coming.
On customizing and actor network theory.
Yeah.
I'm really interested in what you said about the fact that Internet of Things are agents or are. So do you think that